We may as well make a start, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this comfortable room to sit on the most comfortable chairs, which afford you a good place to sit for the afternoon, don't they? So make yourself comfortable, relax, and if you figured out how the tables work, well done. They magically pop up if you pull on them. And so welcome, good to see you all. My name is Ben Holloway, and I'm going to be giving you a little talk this afternoon. So hopefully this will be informative and also helpful in your relative ministries and pursuit of your studies and whatever else you're involved in. Who here is at college presently? Lots of people at college, okay. And so who here is planning on or is presently involved in any form of ministry that involves, a good deal of your time per week? So you're all involved in ministry, okay. And who here is interested in the mission field? Going abroad, overseas, anything like that? Okay, good. So there's lots of people who are being sent, are going to go. And so this is a good thing. This is why we exist here at Southeastern. We're preparing men and women for ministry in the church, overseas and domestically, to preach the gospel, to disciple the saints, and to live our lives to the glory of God. So let me pray as we begin, and then I shall introduce what I'm going to talk about today. Father, we thank you for the truth of the gospel. We thank you that its value is not dependent upon our evaluation of it, that it is a glorious thing, that you have truly sent your Son, Jesus Christ, to die for our sins, that you have bestowed grace upon your people when they are undeserving, that you have called a people for yourself, that we might live for you, that we might have a purpose in life, and that we might have the hope of eternal life. Lord, we long for the day when we are living in our glorified bodies, unable to stop or to prevent ourselves from singing your praises. We look to that day with excitement and anticipation. And we pray, Lord, that in the meantime, while we are in our non-glorified bodies, you might give us a help in worshipping you and praising you with the little strength that you have given us. May our lives shine a light in this world, and may our words be confidently spoken about the truths that you have given us in your word. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. I'm obviously not from around here. I was going to fake a Georgia accent, but it would have been embarrassing. So I'm an Englishman, and not in New York, but in Wake Forest, North Carolina. I'm an instructor of philosophy here at the school. And so I teach in the undergrad. I teach the Great Books course called History of Ideas, where we read voluminous amounts of works. There's lots of fans of History of Ideas back there. I saw them raise their hands. Yes, History of Ideas. It's when I had to stay up all night reading these strange books from long ago. And so Virgil or something like that we made you read. So there is History of Ideas. I also teach philosophy in the undergrad school, so I'm teaching epistemology and philosophy of language at the moment. And I also teach in the seminary Christian philosophy and those sorts of topics that are related to philosophy of religion. So these are what I do in my daily life. I have a history, so I should tell you a little bit about that. And I also have a family. I could perhaps mention them. We live in Wake Forest, and my family, I have a wife. She's from Minnesota, so I married in to the American life, and she's thoroughly inculcated me. So I don't speak American, but I have an American soul now. And I have 3 biological children, and they are homeschooled at the moment. And one non-biological child who's about to enter our family legally. He's in the process of being adopted by us through the foster care system. And so we're very excited. Any day now we're going to drive a long way from taking some paperwork and putting them into a court, and then they legally say you have now adopted this child, and we will call Bryson our son officially. And so this is a very exciting time for me and my family. I am new to teaching at the seminary. I've been here just over a year, enjoying it thoroughly. It is a tremendous place to work as well as study. It is exactly what it looks like. It is the friendliest campus on earth, and thoroughly enjoy being here with a team of incredibly talented staff and faculty and wonderful students. It is a joy to minister in this way, to be part of the training of men and women for service, and so that's what we attempt to do. Today I want to talk about truth and its value, the value of truth. And the reason I want to talk about that is because without knowing the value of truth, you will find defending your worldview and interacting with other worldviews in an effective way almost impossible. And I say this not just because theoretically it's true, and this is what we do in the classrooms, let's talk about things that are theoretically true, but it's because it's experientially true. This is how your ministries are dented oftentimes, and I know from experience that mine were often dented in this way. So I'm going to talk about certain threats that we have to our notion of truth. We think of presumably our worldview is true. The Christian worldview is the right worldview. It is the best worldview. We make claims about the things that we believe, but often when we are presented with a large quantity of unbelievers, we find ourselves folding like pieces of paper in confronting alternative and different worldviews. And I think it comes down to our conception of truth. Rather than our immense courage that we might possess, or our particularly good rhetoric we might have, or the brilliance of our testimony, what comes through at the end of the day is whether we are committed to the truth of the claims we are making. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I talk about this because over the years I have seen many people exalt the story to be the be-all and end-all. And you know what I mean by a good story, a good testimony. I have one myself. I could tell it. It's full of all sorts of fun things that happened. I love good stories. In fact, one of the books that I read when I first became a Christian was Nicky Cruise's Run Baby Run. Has anyone read that book? I thoroughly recommend that book. It's an awesome book. I read it 11 times about a person who was part of a gang, Nicky Cruise, in New York, and how he was visited by an evangelist called David Wilkerson. And David Wilkerson preached the gospel regularly and made friends with Nicky, and Nicky was just about as rebellious as you can imagine in the gang called the Mau Mau's in New York City, and eventually succumbed to the call of God on his life and became a Christian. It was such a powerful story. It made such an impression on my life. But stories have become paramount, if you like. Apologetics, they tell us, is dead. Long live the story. There's no use in trying to give reasons for your faith anymore. This is not persuasive to the modern mind. What we need are powerful stories. If they were only to hear my testimony, they would surely come to believe in Jesus Christ. This is the kind of thing we hear today, and don't get me wrong, as I've mentioned, I love stories. But you can't argue with a story. A story isn't the kind of thing that you can have an argument with. You can give a story of your life and explain your belief in Jesus Christ, and no one can argue with your testimony about how you acquired beliefs about Jesus Christ. No one can debate your story any more than you could debate the statement, Kate believes pigs fly. You can debate whether pigs fly, but you can't debate the fact that she does believe this. And the same is true of your story, unfortunately. You can't have an argument with a story. You can maybe say it didn't happen. This is one way to debate a story, but you certainly can't debate the fact that you have come to believe in Jesus Christ through a process of hearing the gospel. I acquired the belief that Jesus Christ is Lord, that he has the rights to my life. He can do what he wants with me. These are all truths I believe, and that he has graciously bestowed the gospel to me through his ministers, and I have been swept into his church. And I now have this eternal hope in him. I can tell you about my beliefs, and I can tell you that I believe them, but that isn't an argument for the belief in the gospel. And this is a problem if we think that the only thing we have is a story. The only thing we have is a powerful story, and even a powerful story presented in a powerful way, with flashing lights and soft-sounding music. It's so powerful and convincing. Surely the world will see its power and come to believe. Now, again, just a little caveat I like to mention is stories are powerful. They are wonderful means by which God sometimes causes us to be psychologically confirmed in what we believe is true, but they're not arguments. They don't tell us whether those beliefs are true or not. And the reason that I think this is a problem, if we put everything onto a story, is that a story, if it's only a story, if it's only a good story that makes you a Christian, then there's nothing stopping you from getting a better one. And as some of you may have read in recent times, the popular version of the conversion story is the deconversion story. And unfortunately, if you're old enough, you have friends who have also got their own deconversion stories. And being in ministry for a very long time, I started in 1992 with Youth for Christ, traveling in itinerant evangelistic ministry. I heard all the best stories you could possibly imagine. We were youth evangelists. The one thing you needed to do is tell your testimony, and it had to be really, really good. And all my friends were very good at telling their powerful stories about how Jesus saved them. Unfortunately, about 50% of those friends are now those who tell a story that there is a better way, that this fundamentalist evangelical environment they were brought up in left them cold eventually and couldn't really answer the questions that they had, and that now they look to something else, something better. Now they have a more powerful story, because a story never tells you what is true. And if that's true, then the story is only as good as the story itself, not as good as the truths that you believe within it. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, is the truth. I want to talk about the importance of the truth for defending the Christian worldview when you're interacting with other worldviews, for disagreeing with other worldviews. That's sort of impolite at the moment to disagree with people's worldviews. When you disagree with someone's worldview, you're often seen as disliking a person. Somehow the person and the worldview are the same thing, and so it makes us less inclined to have an argument, perhaps. We also are unwilling to pay a price for something we don't think is valuable. So I want to talk about the intrinsic value of truth. Why is it that believing the things we do about the world, about God, and about human beings are intrinsically valuable? They're valuable whether or not you or I believe them at all, whether anyone, in fact, believes them. And once you've grasped the notion of truth that I'm going to give you today, hopefully this will give you more motivation to speak up and to proclaim the gospel, even when it costs you, and even when it's entirely ineffective in your attempts to talk about the gospel. You will see the value overturns your lack of courage to speak. The problem I think we have today, and this is the thing I'm going to address, is our conception of truth. It has become ameliorated. We think of truth as being something that's all about stories, or all about how we've come to believe, or all about culture. But it is none of these things. I'm going to suggest today for you that truth is real. In other words, it couldn't care about your feelings in any sense, and would be that way even if you weren't even here. Something is true. It's outside of yourself. It's not something anybody here gets to control. Truth is real. And I'm also going to suggest that you can know truth. In our time, it's become fashionable to say you can't have any access to truth at all. You should be a skeptic about your own beliefs. You don't really have good reasons to hold those beliefs. And everybody else's beliefs that might conflict with yours have similarly good reasons as yours, and so you should accept all of them to be true, or none of them at all. And I'm also going to suggest that truth has its own value, not dependent upon the effects it has in the world. It doesn't matter what it causes people to do. It is valuable in and of itself. And I think these are three challenges to our beliefs, so much so that I think it's three challenges to our mission. As I said, I've been in evangelistic ministry for a long time, and now being in teaching ministry, I always see this effect that the less we think of truth in this way, the more we are inclined to give up on the truth of the gospel, especially when facing opposition. And these are three challenges. Perhaps I'll write them on board so you can remember their names. They're three challenges, and they've affected me over my ministry. A long time, I've attempted to preach the gospel, and I can remember times at which these kinds of thoughts entered my mind, or these reflections or these oppositions occurred to me, and they did damage to my ministry. So the first one I'm going to talk about, the three threats, okay? Three threats. And they're all about truth. So threat number one is anti-realism. So what is anti-realism? I hear you cry because you're fascinated. Now I've written it on the board. What is anti-realism? Well, anti-realism is the view that truth is not independent of the minds that believe it. That's all it is. So realism is the view that truth is independent of your mind. It has nothing to do with your mind and the way you put the world together. And anti-realism just says the opposite. Anti-realism says that the truth is dependent upon the way you put the world together. Now, to illustrate this, you may be thinking, that's strange. Of course, it's independent of my mind. But let me give you an example of a way to perhaps motivate the idea of anti-realism, and perhaps you've heard this before, and perhaps you've even thought this yourself. There's a great movie which I thoroughly recommend. It's very weird. It's a British movie, so it's weird for that fact. And it's about an Englishman played by who do you think would play the Englishman? Just guess.
David Tennant.
Okay, almost. Mr. Bean. That would be awesome. That would make it even weirder. Who's the guy who plays the English? Everybody loves him. Floppy hair, a little old now. 4 weddings and a funeral. Hugh Grant, right? Hugh Grant. So you've got to have Hugh Grant in a movie like this. And Hugh Grant plays an English official from the British government. So he comes from London and he travels to a little town in Wales. In fact, it's more like a village. And so he goes there and he's an official that is charged with the bureaucratic task of determining whether mounds of dirt on the British landscape count as mountains or whether they are merely hills. And so he goes to a village in which everybody's very proud of their little village's mountain. And this draws great tourism. People want to hike up a mountain. And so this mountain is well known, and they get money because people come and go to the pub in this village and then climb the mountain. And it's very exciting. So they've got to have a mountain. And unfortunately, Hugh Grant arrives and he goes up the mountain and discovers that it is exactly 10 feet shy of the standard of mountainhood, and thus this village is shy of a mountain, but they do in fact have a hill. And so in his return to the village, the villagers are thoroughly disappointed. Now, these are not standard villagers. They are not going to take this lying down. And so the villagers prevent Hugh Grant from leaving to go back to London to record the fact that this village only has a hill and not a mountain. And so they block the trains. And it's terrible weather. This thing they can guarantee. This is, after all, the British Isles. It's always terrible weather, so he can never escape. And they keep him there. And while they keep him there, they take buckets of dirt and they go up the hill. And on the top of the hill, they create a 10-foot pile of dirt to therefore establish mountainhood again. And so they are victorious. And of course, the movie ends with this thoroughly wonderful scene of this. It has now gained mountainhood again. We can all relax, and the villagers are very happy, and we can let Hugh Grant go. Of course, meanwhile, he's fallen in love and he's going to marry and stay there. But that's how all those movies end, right? So this story gives you an idea of what might motivate an anti-realist. Why? Well, why do you think it would? Why would it make you think, well, I can see why this might work. What about mountain and hill and meters and all of these sorts of things? Somehow this makes you think there aren't really mountains or hills, and really meters and height are a bit suspicious too. After all, isn't it just a government bureaucratic system that has developed the idea of a mountain and a hill and determined that it is a particular height and not another particular height? Who, after all, has the idea of mountainhood out there in the world? I mean, God didn't leave a standard mountain and say, if it's close to this, it's a mountain. If it's not, it's not. There's no standard of mountainhood. Mountainhood was just decided in Whitehall. It was like having a bureaucracy in DC decide what a mountain is. And this was decided in London by a bunch of bureaucrats, a bunch of English people sitting there, a mountain 10 feet higher, sure, tip-top, and that sort of thing. And that's what it is. This is the impression you get. And after all, it's counted in meters. And so Hugh Grant is talking about meters. Well, what are meters? Do you have the meter? Does anyone have the meter with them? I mean, the one that we all have to copy to find out all the other meters. And where did that come from? Well, that was just decided by another group, probably in England as well. Or maybe France. It's meters, after all. And they decided on the length of a meter in Paris. Perhaps there is a Paris meter, and that is the meter after which all the other meters are made. And perhaps, height is a bit arbitrary to pick the vertical. I mean, why not something in between, like the horizontal or the breadth? Why not? Mountains are just really wide pieces of dirt. They don't have to be high at all. They just have to be really, really broad. This would make mountains. You can get the idea, right? And if that's true for mountains, that they're really just arbitrary decisions that we've made about how we put the world together, you can think about it for religions. After all, we use concepts like creation, fall, redemption, We use statements about the world like Jesus died for my sin, that God created the world. We use concepts in a similar sort of way as we might talk about mountains. And so the anti-realist says this is just the way it works in the world. There is no truth out there. There's nothing out there that makes anything true. There is just the way you and I put the world together. You grew up in a church and you learned how to talk about the world according to these categories you were given. Just like Hugh Grant grew up in the bureaucracy learning to talk about the mountains as certain heights. You also just grew up amongst other people and you categorized the world in a certain way. You've got spirits to explain certain things, gods to explain other things, and this kind of way of putting the world together is just as good as a materialist way of putting the world together, or indeed just as good as a Buddhist way of putting the world together. All of these are just dependent upon the languages that you've chosen to adopt. So this sounds quite plausible, actually, once you've considered Hugh Grant and his silliness about a mountain. It seems just as silly to the anti-realist to say that we have an actual grasp of what's real in the world. So this is the first threat to our ministry, I think, of truth. Our first threat is to think that there is really no such thing out there that's not dependent upon the categories that we've already adopted by being part of the church or by being part of the English bureaucracy or whatever group you might want to choose. This is what truth is. It's no more than that, and it's no less than that. But it's certainly nothing to do with the way the world is. How would you respond? In fact, let me see. It's now 10 past 2. How would you respond? I know that's a sleepy hour of the afternoon, but maybe some of you are afternoon people and your brains are thoroughly awake. What would you say back to someone who says that to you? You're saying that these things are true, but really they're just ways in which you put the world together. And they are not, there's nothing true in the world that makes them true. It's just the way you think about the world, just like mountains. What would you say? Do you have a reply? Yes, sir.
Christianity hinges on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if you can prove the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you can prove Christianity.
Okay, so you might want to appeal to facts that are out there that we can have evidence for. So, yep, that might be a way to go. Okay.
So gravity, it exists either like whenever you lift something up, it will always fall.
Does it? Does gravity exist? It's a good example. So which version, I would ask you? So there's Newton's version, and there is Einstein's version. And Einstein's version is either true or false, but both of them can't be true. They would have to be, one of them has to be false and one of them has to be true. And they're two different versions of gravity. So you could adopt Einstein's view of gravity, which has to do with like curvy things, relativity and all this jazz, or Newton's view of gravity, which has to do with objects always in motion unless you stop them and these sorts of things. And they both of them explain the dropping of an object onto the floor, but both of them are can't both be true. They might be different ways of chopping up the world. So that's actually almost, you could use that in defense of the anti-realist. I'm hearing the point about the resurrection. I'm going to allow that to rest. But do you see how that works, the scientific point of view? You can have two different theories that explain the same thing. And by the way, that is what they would say about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There are theories, multiple ways in which you could put that story together, none of which are true about the world. They are merely made true by our conceptual apparatus, if you like. So resurrections can be explained in multiple different ways, not all of them explained according to the way the Bible puts it together, for example. Yes, sir?
Seems like the anti-realist perspective or lens under their worldview would be just yet another lens through which they're viewing the world. Why would their lens be any better than the next person's lens?
Okay, that's not a bad response. So you've got to say, well, look, you've got a sort of a way of conceptualizing the world that you've put together according to anti-realism. Well, who's to say that's right? If you adopt your view, surely then my realist version of truth is just as good as yours. Maybe it's self-defeating. Okay, that might be a good response. That's a good strand there. Well, who else got any ideas? What would you say to this sort of idea? By the way, this is a very common idea. Anti-realism, extremely common way to approach science, common way to approach religion. Don't believe me? Just look at all the opposition you have to exclusive claims of religious truth. You'll find lots of people respond by saying, truth is not like that. There's no thing out there that makes anything true. It's just the way your culture puts things together. That's all we have. Yes, sir.
So if my truth is I get to take your car.
Yes, then I'm not going to like that, am I? It's going to go against my conceptual scheme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's that's definitely not your truth. Your truth is that I just stole your car.
Yes. So maybe this has unlikable consequences, we could say. Let's take this all the way, take your worldview for a walk, if you like, and see what happens. And it might be that I take your car out too. So, okay, good response. And I like both those. Those are interesting ways to approach this. One of the ways you can approach this, and this will refer back to mountains, was an idea of Peter van Inwagen, who's a philosopher that is worth reading. He's good fun. He says, why don't you just take any old statement about mountains? And he's not responding to the movie, by the way. So let's talk about Mount Everest. Everest? I don't know. So let's say, I'm going to make the number simple. It's not this, but let's say it's 8,000 meters high. So there's a statement about the world, and you can do the same thing with this as you did in the movie with Hugh Grant. Mount Everest is 8,000 meters high. All these things are decided by convention. What is a meter? Mountains, what counts as a mountain? Meters and height. These are all conventions that we've put together to describe the world, but that has nothing to do with the world itself. It's just a way we carve up the world. And Van Inwagen asked us to do this. So I should have left a little more. In fact, we need an M there, maybe. Instead of saying mountains, we call them schmountains, and meters are now schmeters, and heights are now schmites. And you can have schmeier and schmeiest mountain and these sorts of things. So you can go to town on this. And perhaps all the concepts are different. So mountains aren't the same kind of thing. Perhaps they have to be somewhat deeper as well. There's a different way to carve up the world. Perhaps it's mountain parts. Schmountains just means there has to be a particular selection of shapes on a hillside, something like that. Who cares? Any which way you want to carve up the world. Schmeters, maybe it's not this high, maybe it's the same height, but it's like at an angle or something like that, or there's a little bit of depth involved. Who knows? Just a different kind of measurement. And that schmite is how you talk about those measurements. So you can carve up the world in all sorts of different ways. And his point is to say that this is no less made true by the world than the original statement. Mount Everest is 8,000 meters high is still true because the mountain is the way it is in the world, as is the schmountain. The mountain and the schmountain are what they are in the world because that's the way they are. And what makes both of these statements true has nothing to do with you. Your conceptual grid can carve up the world any way you please, sir, he says. Just in every case, they're only true if that is actually the way the world is. So this is a good response to an anti-realist argument. This tells us that truth is totally mind independent. It doesn't depend on you and your conceptual schemes or the way your culture puts things together. It's true out there. Whichever way your culture tries to put the world together, what makes those statements about the world true is not the way your culture put these things together, but the world itself. It is objectively true. Truth is out there. Van Inwagen writes, our beliefs and our assertions represent the world as being a certain way, and the belief that our assertion is true of the world is that way, and false if the world is not that way. The truth or falsity of our beliefs and assertions is therefore objective, in the sense that the truth and falsity are conferred on those beliefs and assertions by their objects, the things that they are about. He says that anti-realists are really, what they are is anti-authorists. They don't like things to stand over them. And of course, he says this is mostly about God, but truths are things that stand over you. You don't get a say in them. You don't get your preference. Truth doesn't care about what you want. It just is the way it is. He writes this, I thought it was very powerful. He writes, anti-realists are deeply hostile to the thought of anything that in any sense stands in judgment over them. The idea to which they are most hostile is, of course, the idea of there being a God. But they're almost as hostile towards the idea of there being an objective universe that doesn't care what they think and could make their most cherished beliefs false without even consulting them. I'd also want to say that if you don't think truth is like this, you'll never bother disagreeing over it. Because what are you disagreeing over? You're just disagreeing over a difference between the way you two people put the world together. If you're on the mission field and you see someone with a completely different culture and a different way of putting the world together, and you are confronted with this question, is theirs any better than mine? Could theirs just be a different way of putting the world together? Are these things really true in the sense that they are out there making me have to believe them? Aren't they just ways we carve up the world? And this is a mistake. Why? Because you'll never disagree anything that's not there. You'll just differ. And stories will tell us our differences. They will tell us how we acquire different beliefs. Telling you what we believe will tell you about differences, but you'll never disagree. And you'll never fight for a Christian worldview when you're confronted with different ones. And I want you to do more than interact with other worldviews, as the title of the talk implies. I want you to defend and disagree and value the Christian worldview, the Christian truth, enough so that even if you are rejected for it, it'll be worth the price you pay. So that's the first threat. First threat to Christian ministry in regards to truth is the view that it isn't there at all. But that's not the only way you can come up against a Christian truth. There is another way you can object to it, and that is called skepticism. Now you're really testing my... How do you do that? Schism. It could be an S or a C. It's ambiguous. This is when you invite a dyslexic to do a talk and write on the board. I always warn my students that I'm going to make mistakes on the board, and they are free to correct them. I think it's a C, so I'm going to go with C. I feel more confident now. C according to me, anyway. So skepticism is the second challenge to Christian truth. What is skepticism? Well, perhaps you say, well, look, there is objective truth. The world is the way it is. It doesn't care about my feelings, as the phrase goes. But the thing is, I can't really have any knowledge of it. So perhaps there are truths about the world. Perhaps Jesus, the truth that Jesus rose from the dead is either true or false. Like, it's in the world. It doesn't care what I feel about it. It's not part of my conceptual scheme. It's not the way I put the world together. But I don't know if it's true. Because there's one thing to say that something is true or false. There's another thing to say whether you know it or not, right? Your confidence in a belief is directly related to how many reasons you have to believe it, right? Or how rational you are in believing it. And perhaps we're just not that rational. Or perhaps we just can't get at good enough reasons. And so this is the second way you can object to the truth. You can say that there is objective truth, it is out there, and we should accord our beliefs to it, but I cannot be confident that I'm right about those beliefs, and therefore I should lower my confidence in my worldview. This is certainly the skeptical challenge. Skepticism comes in many forms, and in philosophy we look at all sorts of funny little forms like the brain in the vat skepticism. This is a weird one that if you have had this as a child, you've had this wondering as a child, you're probably going to end up in a philosophy department sometime. I think it's a disease, actually, for philosophers. You're young and you think to yourself, maybe I'm not really here. Maybe I'm just having a lot of experiments conducted on me. I'm really in a lab, and someone's just wired me up to some electrodes, and that they've wired me up in such a way that everything I'm experiencing, I think I'm experiencing, but I'm not really experiencing. Now, if you've ever had this little dream, I recommend you talk to our philosophy department about enrolling here in the philosophy at Southeastern, because you will need some help with your problem with skepticism. And this is, it's a very normal thing. If you have a philosophical mind, you're going to wonder whether things are really there as they appear. And so skepticism can be of this kind, a sort of brain in the vat skepticism. You're really no more than a brain in a nice vat of whatever preservative they put in there, and then just electrodes plugged onto your brain, and this gives you the experience that you're having. Or perhaps there is scientific method skepticism. How do we really know the scientific method gives us truth? Perhaps it doesn't at all. Perhaps our methods are all messed up. And this would also give us skepticism, because if your method is messed up, your conclusions are going to be messed up, and they're not going to be right. And therefore you could just say, well, we've got a method, we've got some conclusions, but how do we really know? And who am I to say? Probably a more pressing version of skepticism that approaches us during our day and age. I thought it was going to go away. I thought this was such a silly skepticism. I was infected with it for a while, and I sort of had to wrestle with it. And I thought it was gone and done with, but it seems to return in many different forms. And this kind of skepticism is, I call it genealogical skepticism. And genealogies are stories of origins, so where things come from. So a genealogy you might have for a belief, not just for where a person comes from. And so this skepticism was most prominent in the works of people like Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher, German philosopher, and Karl Marx. And some people who espouse something called religious pluralism have this kind of skepticism. So Nietzsche was like this. He thought that you could explain the origin of a belief, and this would give you reason to doubt that belief. And so you've probably heard someone say to you, well, you're just saying that because you're a Christian or just because you grew up in a nice family, and you wouldn't say that if you were born somewhere else. And this is supposed to give you a sort of a doubt about your belief. Well, if you can explain the origin of it, and you can show that the origin of it doesn't come from anywhere particularly important in the world, it's just that happens to be the way things are, therefore you should doubt your belief. So Nietzsche thought that Christian and Judeo-Christian morals came from a feeling of resentment against those who are ruling the world, and he says this in the Genealogy of Morals: the slave's revolt in morals begins with this, that resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. So values are not things that are over and above us, that they are created merely by our situation. Or in Beyond Good and Evil, he criticizes English liberal values, which is not a bad thing, but he's obviously not into English things at all. He says, observe, for example, the indefeatable, inevitable English utilitarians. This was the sort of ruling idea in England at the time. In the end, all they want is English morality, to be recognized as authoritative. They would like to convince themselves that the striving after English happiness is at the same time the true path of virtue. In fact, that, so far as there has been virtue in the world hitherto, it has just consisted in such striving. In other words, there's no such true morality. The morality of the English is just English morality, and that's all it is. It's just their perspective, and they will impose it on us by power, but it's not true, and we can never know what that is. This is just English morality. And you can see what this does. It sort of lends weight to the fact that you just believe the way you do because of the way you're brought up. And that's just not enough to think that that's actually true. So you should doubt the belief that you have. Karl Marx, another person who uses this kind of argument all the time, in his book, The Communist Manifesto, he argues against an apparent objector who says, hey, Karl, I would like to keep my traditional family the way it is, and your system abolishes the traditional family? He says, yes, it does. And this objector says, well, surely that's bad. Why can't I keep my traditional family, and can you leave us alone? No. You will enjoy being a communist, which is empirically verifiable nonsense, and you just have to wait until you've enjoyed communism enough, and you will forget about these beliefs. They will just disappear. The only reason you believe those things, that there should be traditional families, that this is the best way to bring children up in the world, etc., is because you were brought up as a bourgeoisie, he says. And this explains where the origin of your beliefs are, and it also explains why they disappear when we're finally brought in the new revolution and have utopia. This is sort of Karl Marx's argument, and he does it to all the objections. You can say, well, what about private property? So, well, you only believe in private property because you're a bourgeoisie, but once you're not a bourgeoisie and you've been to a good re-education camp, you will eventually say, oh, yes, no, private property is horrible. I couldn't believe I used to believe such an awful thing. This is his idea. This is a defeater for your beliefs. And you say, well, okay, I guess, what do I do now? This is a form of skepticism, is it not? It says that you can doubt your beliefs because you can explain the origin of your beliefs. So let's put our thinking hats on. What would you say to someone who says something like that of you? You have just been brought up that way. In fact, perhaps you went to Southeastern and you believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. You believe the Bible is true and authoritative. And so you are confronted with someone who says, yeah, but lots of Yale students don't believe that, and they looked at the same Bible. They have the same library as you, and they don't believe that it's inerrant. And so maybe it's just the fact that you went to Southeastern, and so you should doubt the fact that the Bible is inerrant, because I can explain how you got the belief that the Bible is inerrant. Yes, do you have an idea of how to reply? Was it you, or someone had their hand up over there? Who has a way to say something back to the skeptic, the genealogical skeptic? What would you say? Yes, sir.
You doubt the Bible because that's how you were raised.
Yes. That's what he's saying to you. And you can say it back, right?
You can say you doubt the Bible because that's how you were brought up.
Okay, yes. So that's a good place to start, isn't it? Because if there's a story of how I acquired the belief that the Bible is inerrant, it's without error, then there's probably a story for how your friend came to believe that the Bible is not inerrant and, in fact, is filled with errors all over the place. So maybe you could just start there. That's a good point to start. Where would you go next off that? Yes, sir.
You could say you can't doubt belief A without, except on some basis that belief B you're believing instead at the moment, right? Like you can't doubt belief A unless you have another belief. So you're kind of confronted by your doubt, so to speak, to say no one can know enough to be certain about God and religion, right, without assuming at that moment you know enough, right, to be certain about that.
Okay, you may need to expand that. Did everyone understand that, or would you like a little? Give it a concrete example. So you've got two people who disagree, and one of them says, "Well, you only believe that because of some story."
Yeah, so I guess it would be like I don't know, like you were debating whether or not the Japan existed.
Okay.
And you're like, well, I'm certain it doesn't exist, and you, in order to know that it didn't exist, you would have to be certain enough about your belief about some pre-existing belief.
So every belief relies on another belief, and at least one of them has to be certain in order for you to sort of doubt presupposes certainty or something like that. Yes.
In other words, to say doubt your doubts.
Yes. Okay, good. So that might be, that's, it comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein uses that argument. You can't doubt without presupposing something you certainly know. So that's a good response. It requires a little bit of argumentation to get you there. Perhaps some of you can think of alternative ways, but that's a very good way to respond. But let's see if we can elicit some other ways. I mean, if you're confronted with this, you'll need to have something to say. And moreover, if this comes into your mind and you think, oh, that does make me less confident in my Christian beliefs, you'll want something not to confront someone else, but confront yourself on this issue. Because surely you don't think, just because I was brought up that way, that means I should doubt it. But what do I say back to myself if I start to think that way? And believe me, I have thought that way in my ministry in the past, especially when I was younger. I had this little doubt. I thought, well, who's to say this is true? How do I know? It's just what I've acquired. I can explain where it came from, but is it really? Should I be confident about it? Can I be objectively certain in some way? What would you say? Any ideas? Yes, sir.
The inerrancy in Scripture
Mm-hmm.
would say that it was written half a world away from where I live, where I grew up, where my family's from,
Mm-hmm.
in two different languages that I don't speak, and between 66 authors that I have no connection to genealogically. So
The idea here is you want to defend the particular claim with evidences, perhaps, okay? But for the skeptic, they are saying you've only accepted these evidences because of some kind of story that your life has, some sort of causal story that has given you these beliefs, because all evidences rely on other evidences. So yes, and what you want is to get them to the point where you can actually debate over the thing itself. But before you get there, you've got to defeat the skepticism, because the skeptic won't say, well, let's examine the evidence. Because why? Well, they already are telling you that the evidence isn't important here. What's important here is the story you can tell about someone's gaining a belief, not necessarily the evidence for the thing itself. But you're absolutely right. That's exactly where you want to go. You want to get them to say, okay, I admit I shouldn't be a skeptic. You can know the truth. So now let's look at the evidence. Is it actually true that the Bible's inerrant? But before you get there, you've got to say, well, I want to just deal with your skepticism. And you need to deal with your own. Any other ideas? Yes, sir.
I was going to say, it seems like this worldview of skepticism kind of falls apart because we can be skeptical about anything.
Mm-hmm.
So we could be skeptical about, should I eat food or not? And so if you're skeptical about everything, then everything kind of falls apart. So how do we know if we're skeptical about this?
What do you mean fall apart in that you can't live as a skeptic? You have to believe that if you step out in front of a bus, your life will not go well, right? That's the sort of thing you'd have to believe. And that is a good response to skepticism. You see, you're not skeptical about everything, though. You do think there are some things you know. So that's a good response, too, is to play on the idea that there are some things that you're not that skeptical about, and if you were, it would really go bad for you. So good. It's impractical. Skepticism is ultimately impractical. You have to believe certain things. But they may just say, well, with those things I'm a little more sure, and but belief in God, not so much. But good response. Yes, sir.
Well, wouldn't the mere fact that someone is being skeptical and doubting beliefs allude to the idea that they inherently are searching for some sort of definitive truth?
So skepticism tells you about their heart in some way?
They are searching for a truth.
Okay.
Like if you're going to say like, oh, how can I know that you believing in God is right based on your like upbringing, then you're saying like, in a sense, like you're trying to find out a truth, some sort of truth. Like you were saying, a skeptic would say like, perhaps there is a definitive truth, but I can't know what that is for sure. But in doubting the truth, you're searching for a truth.
Yes, maybe this reveals their desire for the truth. So okay, that's a good story, and I'm running low on time, so I want to give you the last threat. But that's good. Maybe that's a good place to start. In fact, you could start to say, well, let me tell you the causal history of the belief you're about to obtain from me when I've explained to you about the resurrection of the dead and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And maybe I could be part of the causal explanation for why you become a Christian. So maybe that's a good response. You could say, well, you're now going to encounter the gospel, and as you do, maybe this will cause you to believe it. And so you could just say, this may well happen, right? But would that make it true or not? Or does any causal story tell you whether those beliefs are true? You've got to notice a distinction here. A story, remember, only tells you what someone believes and how they came to believe it. A belief in itself is either true or false. And a story can't tell you whether it's true or false. Neither can explaining your story as to how you became a Christian and how you acquired a bunch of beliefs can't tell you whether those beliefs are true or not. And so if someone says to you, you're just saying that because you're a Christian, you could say, well, I am a Christian. I was brought up in a Christian home, and I have all sorts of stories I could tell about how I got there, but none of them tell me why they're true or not. Let me talk about that. Because truth can be objectively known by all of us. Your story does not determine how you look at evidence. It might give you preferences. It might tell you that you prefer to see the Bible as inerrant, but it doesn't take away your ability to observe the world and make conclusions from it. It doesn't. It might make it difficult sometimes to say, well, let me look at the evidence objectively because there's a lot invested in it. But it doesn't take away your ability to look at the evidence and determine whether something is true or not. Your ability to be objective about the truth is not determined by your psychology, the way your brain was put together in upbringing, in culture. These things do not take away the power you have as a human being using logic, using evidences, using clear thinking. We all have that. It doesn't matter what culture you're from. Everybody has certain rational equipment, and there's certain reasoning methods that the world, you can't get away with without them, right? And everyone has those. And if you employ those, you can come to know the truth. Imagine if you couldn't come to know the truth by any objective means whatsoever. You were always determined by whatever conceptual scheme you happen to inherit. It would be almost useless to do apologetics. You could have a nice conversation, and you could maybe think, well, some of my beliefs might change causally because someone says something powerful. But you could never actually disagree with someone over their beliefs, nor could you ever stand up for a worldview despite immense opposition. You would be left with, well, we have a conversation. I hear people say things like this: the truth is objective, so they're realists, but my beliefs are always shaped by my upbringing and my experiences. Therefore, we should listen to multiple perspectives. And I just want to ask, why would you listen to multiple perspectives? If your beliefs are always shaped by your experience and there's nothing you can do about it, you're always going to come out with the belief that you prefer, then what's the point in talking to multiple perspectives? Surely talking to multiple perspectives and interacting with worldviews is determine which one is right. But you can't do that if you just believe that all the beliefs you're going to get are just a matter of your psychological upbringing. You want to look at the evidence, and so you want to end up where you suggested, looking at the evidence but being objective about it. And there's no reason to think you are not objective when you look at evidence. We all have reasoning faculties, and we can do it. I have no time to talk about the third one except mention it. The third challenge to our motives for speaking the truth, for not just engaging with different worldviews, but for defending our own, for paying the price for our beliefs, particularly in ostracization or in making people upset when we say, I just have a truth claim. And I don't mean that you should be rude and mean about them. We all should be humble. But the manner in which you tell people about the truth shouldn't neglect the matter on which you speak. And so the truth has its own value, and pragmatists will tell you it doesn't. Pragmatists will tell you that the only thing that makes truth valuable is its effect. They will say, well, the truth of Jesus Christ dying for your sin is only really valuable if someone comes to believe in it and their life is changed. And this actually is kind of a subtle thing that you will do if you are in evangelistic ministry. You will see the value of the gospel go up and down depending on your statistics. So being in itinerant evangelism, it was all about numbers, how many people came down to the front at the end of the night. And I would preach my best sermons and give my best funny illustrations and stories and everything else and use every technique in the book and music and whatever have you to talk about the gospel. But my measurement of the value of the gospel was somewhat related to how many people actually accepted it at the end of the night. If the more, the better, right? And the value of that truth seemed to go up and down dependent upon its effect. This is the pragmatist. There are lots of illustrations of this, including in schools. Pragmatists will say that truth is really only valuable if it solves a problem. So what do? Well, you look around at problems and you say, how do we solve this problem? And then you look at things that will help you solve the problem, including the Bible, perhaps. And then you solve the problem, you say it's got value now. It's valuable truth because it's solved the problem. In fact, we do this as in theology sometimes. Sometimes theology is driven by experience. You begin with a lived experience and you say, okay, I've got a problem in lived experience. What does the Bible say? And if it answers the question and helps you live that experience better, therefore this has value. This is the pragmatist approach to truth. And in Paul's second letter, it's actually his fourth letter to the Corinthians, he spells out an idea of the gospel that treats it differently. He says that there is an intrinsic value to the truth of the gospel that doesn't depend on anybody's appreciation of it. In fact, you could all just think it's the fragrance of death, he says. But this gospel is so valuable, this treasure that I have to communicate doesn't lose its value dependent on people's reaction to it. Of course, he wants the truth to have a good effect, but its value is independent of our appreciation of it. And in our current climate, where preaching the gospel is often going to cause offense, where people will turn their back on you, where people will dismiss you, where people will say the Christian faith is no longer relevant to our world, we've moved on from that, in a culture which says that proclaiming the gospel is somehow a bad thing to do, it's attacking other worldviews, you and other people, you will find that knowing the intrinsic value of the gospel, no matter who believes it, will keep you preaching it for a lot longer than those first few events where no one shows up or when no one listens. You will be determined to keep going your whole life. And that's my prayer for those who come to Southeastern, is not that they go out and make a big bang for 5 minutes, but that they hear the truth, they know it's there and it won't change, it's real, that they can know it and be confident in it because they can be objective to understand it and know that it's true, and that they can find value in it that's not reliant upon how effective it is in the world or how beautiful it looks on stage with all the lights, but its value is in itself, the gospel. The truth of the gospel has its own value, and that's the kind of thing that changes the world. That's my prayer for students. It's also my prayer for you coming to the Go conference. I thank you very much for coming. I'm sorry I talked long without a lot of time to talk at the end, but you are very welcome to come and chat to me. Now we will close, and you are then free to go to your next session. Thank you very much.